The purpose of today's video is to discuss what I see as issues with the report that was issued by Dan Brown & Associates on behalf of Missouri DOT for their pile research project for restrikes. This report was issued by MoDOT on August 1st of 2023. For conciseness, I'll simply refer to Dan Brown & Associates as Dan Brown throughout this video. So first, I want to state what I think are the limitations that I see with this study, particularly relative to the objectives that were listed in the RFP. I'll also address what I consider to be incorrect statements that were made in the Dan Brown report issued by MoDOT. I'll also illustrate the utility and importance of the relational database and dashboards that FTC has created with a much broader set of data. And finally, I'll let you know the process for how MoDOT can utilize the PileTrac data services created by FTC in order to take their initial study to a higher level of utility and reliability, if interested. By way of introduction, my name is Casey Jones. I'm a PE and PG in the state of Missouri and many other states. We perform the vast majority of construction phase dynamic pile testing for driven pile, as well as cross-hole sonic logging and other drill shaft tests for bridge projects throughout the state of Missouri. I've been involved with such testing for well over 20 years, and my company has been providing these services for well over 15 years. And again, we provide the majority of these services during construction throughout the state. I've been a practicing engineer for over 36 years. So when this RFP came out in 2021 to look at the possibility for MoDOT to utilize time-dependent capacity setups, I was very interested, and we formed a team that was quite competitive, and MoDOT indicated that our team came in second place, and Dan Brown was selected for the study. But as part of our pursuit for this study, I realized how much data I actually had for projects in Missouri and Kansas and other states. So I thought, if we did this study, I'd use this body of data to make a more effective research project. So when we weren't selected for the study, I decided to pursue Kansas DOT to see if they'd be interested in utilizing a system that consisted of a relational database and an online interactive dashboard to look for trends and correlations with the PDA data for various projects across their state. Given KDOT's encouragement and suggestions for how they could utilize such a system, FTC created the PileTrac data service based on historical PDA test results for pile-supported bridges. Also note that FTC has a patent pending on PileTrac. So we continued to develop the PileTrac system in 2022. Kansas DOT became a subscriber on October 1st, 2022, and they continue to use it quite extensively to help improve not only the design, but also the construction phase management of their pile-supported bridge projects. In fact, Kyle Halverson, who's the chief geologist for KDOT, gave a presentation at the 2023 Highway Geology Symposium describing their use of the PileTrac system. If you'd like to check out the video of his presentation, you can see it here. So for the PileTrac data service, we currently have over 66 bridge projects with PDA data entered into the system. The majority of these data sets are from FTC's file, but they're being supplemented on an ongoing basis by KDOT's information that they have in their files. Our data sets for Missouri projects include PDA results from approximately 250 bridge sites. To date, we've entered the data sets from 50 of these bridge sites into PileTrac. This data set represents hundreds of PDA tests. This is the current distribution of counties in Missouri and Kansas where we have entered data for PDA projects. I consider myself fortunate that KDOT was receptive to my suggestions about developing this relational database with interactive dashboard visualizations. Also, if it hadn't been for MoDOT issuing the RFP for the original pile restrike study, I don't think I would have had the idea to compile the results from hundreds of PDA tests that are in my company files into a powerful and useful data service. Unfortunately, it is my opinion that the data sets used by Dan Brown Associates in their study for MoDOT was too small of a sample size given the study objectives, and only addressed 14-inch and 16-inch diameter pipe pile. FTC's available data set includes the full range of pile sizes that have been used throughout the state of Missouri. These data sets also include hundreds of PDA restrike results. Dan Brown & Associates recognized that their data set was too small to provide setup factors for the predominantly sandy soil profiles in southeastern Missouri. To me, this is a big shortcoming of the study in my opinion, as the greatest pile overruns have tended to come from MoDOT projects in southeastern Missouri in my experience. Also in the report, there are statements regarding poor data quality. It appears that most of the data sets used by Dan Brown for this study came from FTC reports for PDA testing. In Table 2 of the Dan Brown report, they state that all of the test data for Bridge A8320 in Atchison County consisted of poor CapWAP quality. Yet the vast majority of test results had CapWAP match quality numbers under 5.0, which is the goal. Now, I can appreciate why an author of a study would either include or exclude certain data sets based on their normalization process. However, I don't think it's appropriate that some of these data sets were excluded for the reason of, quote, poor quality results. I think one of the biggest issues I have with the Dan Brown report is their incorrect conclusion that pile restrike tests were performed without a hammer that had been warmed up beforehand. This assertion relative to the restrike test performed by FTC is simply incorrect. The fact is, warming up the hammer prior to performing a restrike PDA test is a basic part of the testing process, and we direct the contractor to perform such warm-ups routinely and consistently. Apparently, Dan Brown and Associates performed a simplified statistical analysis to reach this incorrect conclusion and had no direct evidence to support their conclusion. They also apparently didn't consider other factors, such as differences in capacity requirements and pile length among the various bridge substructures. It also appears that they didn't consider the possibility for variable subsurface conditions across the site. In fact, it was quite common that not all substructure locations had a corresponding boring. Some projects didn't have any borings performed at intermediate bent locations, as an example. Had Dan Brown Associates simply asked those involved in performing the PDA testing for FTC, or had asked the contractors involved with such projects, they would have been informed that hammer warm-ups were performed prior to restrike testing on FTC projects. In fact, some of these PDA restrike tests were performed personally by me, and I can assure you that I had the contractor warm up the hammer prior to performing the restrike test. Keep in mind that I was trying to help the contractor and MoDOT avoid having to dry piling past planned depths in many of these cases, and using a hammer that had not been warmed up would have simply been counterproductive. Also, it's apparent from the hammer, ram, stroke, and pile sets that sufficient energy was delivered during these restrike tests such that it would be indicative of a hammer that was properly operating. Finally, it should be understood that many of the restrike tests that FTC performed represented extra work that neither we nor the contractor were compensated for. We often did these restrike tests because the pile didn't reach capacity at planned tip elevation, and there were no provisions for restrike testing listed in the plans on most of these jobs. Such restrikes were performed on FTC's own initiative when required capacity was not reached at planned depth, in an effort to document time-dependent capacity increases so that additional piling would not be required at the project sites. In fact, this was successful on many projects in avoiding additional pile lengths beyond plan. So I guess you could say this was an early application of time-dependent capacity increases as demonstrated through short-term restrike tests that we performed as part of our project work. And I think both the contractor and MoDOT greatly benefited from our taking this initiative and performing such restrike testing. My final key thought on the Dan Brown Associates report for MoDOT is I think that the recommended procedures to be incorporated into MoDOT's EPG for accounting for time-dependent capacity increases will be too cumbersome for designers to follow from a practice standpoint, in my opinion. I think a larger data set could support simpler methods that could be readily adopted by pile designers for these projects. Okay, so I don't want to dwell on the issues that I see with the Dan Brown Associates report. So let's get on to the more positive aspects that I see for moving forward. Through the PileTrac data service, FTC can provide setup factors for a wider range of pile sizes and for more locations throughout northern Missouri and southeastern Missouri, where such time-dependent capacity increases are very important. I'll take you through some of the key plots that we have here in our dashboard visualizations from the PileTrac data service. From our data sets, setup factors can be provided for the sandy soil profiles in the region of southeastern Missouri, as we have significantly more data than was used by Dan Brown Associates for their study for MoDOT. As I mentioned earlier, PileTrac is offered as a professional service on a subscription basis. PileTrac can be used to identify trends in pile data across the state that include such things as average penetration into bedrock, average pile lengths by county, and locations where actual pile lengths were much greater or shorter than planned. Of course, PileTrac can also be used to examine time-dependent capacity increases based on our PDA restrike tests that were performed following initial drive testing. PileTrac can also be used by inspectors to get a good idea beforehand about likely pile sets and hammer ram strokes, as well as the selection of the appropriate pile hammer for the project. Also, I want to show you the Restrike plots that we have for various counties in the northern part of Missouri. We also have numerous data sets for southeastern Missouri as well. So let's look at some of the time-dependent capacity increases that we've documented for PDA tests that were performed for both initial drive and restrike tests. In fact, many of them had multiple restrike intervals. This is one of the dashboards in the PileTrac data service. Right now, I'm displaying results for the northern portion of Missouri. So let's just look at, say, Atchison County right now. You can see I've got quite a few data sets there, but you can look at it by county by county. If you look at Harrison County, this was from a project where these lower capacities were for pile at plan tip elevation, and then we have redrive to greater depths, and then the time-dependent capacity increases associated with those greater depths. And what's interesting is the slope of most of the plots are very similar. So again, this is just to give you an idea of the extensive amount of data that we have in our data service for PileTrac. So where do we go from here? So I reached out to MoDOT a few months ago to tell them that I had this PileTrac data services available and had already entered in over 50 Missouri bridge projects with initial drive and PDA restrike data. I figured that such a resource would be a good follow-on to their pile restrike study, even though I hadn't seen the contents of the study. And now I'm particularly convinced that it would be very beneficial for MoDOT to use this system. I haven't heard back from MoDOT yet, but I hope to in the near future. I'm also considering offering PileTrac to major contractors who do work in the state of Missouri for bridge projects. Particularly, I think it would be of beneficial use to the design-build contractors. They can get a pretty good handle on typical pile sizes, lengths, and capacities that have been actually successful at various bridge projects throughout the state of Missouri. And I think their utilization of the PileTrac data service would be very beneficial. To the extent that anyone from MoDOT would like to learn more about the PileTrac data service and how they can expand the scope and utility for improving pile design and installation based on historical PDA test data by subscribing to the PileTrac data service, please contact me. I've put my email address in the description to this video. I strongly believe that MoDOT's utilization of the PileTrac data service would provide for far more efficient pile design that would result in significant cost savings and reduce delays associated with pile-supported bridge projects throughout the state of Missouri. And as I mentioned earlier, I think using the larger data sets that are contained in the PileTrac data service would provide for adoption of a simpler design methodology that could be implemented than what was suggested in the study report for revisions to MoDOT's EPG for pile design when utilizing pile setup. Another benefit for MoDOT using PileTrac is to be able to track how well the implementation of time-dependent capacity increases is working to achieve the desired design requirements for piling. Keep in mind that a MoDOT subscription to the PileTrac data service would cost far less than what I understand was the $150,000 fee that MoDOT paid for the study performed by Dan Brown and Associates. At least that was the maximum amount listed in the RFP back in 2021. Well, thanks for watching, and please note that I have a variety of pile and drilled shaft and other geotechnical content on the FTC YouTube channel. I release a new video every week, so please stay tuned for future videos. And again, if you have any questions, please let me know. My email is in the description. Thanks very much.